Hey guys, welcome to my fabulous world. It's good to see you. Another day, another opportunity for us to connect. And today, I'm back at Wits, and today I'm talking to Professor Tanja Sakota. Here's the thing: Tanja is the first white person I'm interviewing, and I'm excited about that because of her story, her life story, that I find fascinating. I haven't read her book, but I've heard about it, and this is her book. But we'll be talking with her some more. But as I go on, remember to subscribe. Remember to click notifications so that you get notified when a new episode drops, and comments. As you know, I try as much as possible to respond. And let's go. Tanja, how are you?
I'm well. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm very excited to speak to you. And yes, I'm quite honored to be the first white person that you're going to speak to.
I'm just being spicy, you know, when I say you're the first white interview. It's really not important, but I'm just noticing.
Noting it.
Yeah, but it's not really. But I'm glad that we're talking. I mean, both you and I are Wetsis. We were here. We were talking earlier that I got to Wits in 1989. You got to Wits in 1990. You grew up in South Africa. You're a professor in film and media studies. Is that
film and television? Yeah,
film and television. And so you've experienced Wits I've experienced Wits as a student and as an academic, and you probably have done the same. And but your parents came to South Africa at a particular time. And tell us a little bit about your background, where you grew up, and also the little history about your family's background, because that's important for our conversation.
Okay, so my parents came from. My mother was born in Germany during the Second World War, and my father was born and my mother was born in a province called Silesia. She was born in a town called Breslau. And my father was born in a village called Kozice near the town of Stolac in Herzegovina. Now, both these countries don't really exist, which is, I think, why separation, borders, boundaries pay some relevance in terms of who I am and how I see myself. My parents both came, so my mother was forced out of Breslau, Silesia post Second World War, and Silesia was given to Poland. So today it is current day Poland. My father, the village was destroyed in the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, and there are images of the village, and in the film there's the films attached to the book which you can see. So I go on that journey in 1997. I go to my father's village and I film footage, and there are images of that there. So that village now belongs to Bosnia and Herzegovina as a country. So Yugoslavia no longer exists. Germany as the country as it was when my mother was born no longer exists. And they moved post Second World War. They were moved literally to South Africa at different times in the 1950s. So my mother was a refugee that was then relocated to South Africa.
And they were moved by what? By the Germans? Or?
Well, by the authorities and by decisions. So the decision that affected my mother's movement came from Joseph Stalin, because he made the decision to move. In the end, 15 million people were moved. My mother and her family, who was left, were moved. And
when you say they were moved, they were not moved to South Africa, they were moved elsewhere.
They were moved from what was Silesia, the province of Silesia. They were moved into the new borders of Germany. So my mother...
And that was East Germany.
So first it was East Germany, and then they escaped from east to west. And they were, my mum says, for about 6 or 7 years, they were in Hamburg, and then from there they were moved to South Africa.
Okay, and to South Africa, who moved them? Was it the German government, or was
they were refugees, and there were decisions that were made, and you could apply to where you were going to go, and it was which country took you.
Is it?
So that's how...
And that's some history that many young people in South Africa don't know, that in the 50s there was a time when South Africa created an opportunity for some refugees in Europe to come to South Africa.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And of course, we ended up with a multicultural country that even white people it's multicultural, it's a mix.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I was born my parents met in South Africa.
Oh, is it? I thought they were married.
No, they met here.
So they didn't escape together.
No, they met. They came my mother came in around about 1956, my father about 1958. But on the same ship. Oh, ironically, it was called the Africa. Oh. And interestingly enough, I've had 2 discussions, and Terry Kogan, who was my interlocutor for the launch at the Holocaust and Genocide Center, she went on a cruise. She was born in Cape Town, and she went on a cruise to Mozambique on that cruise ship
that brought people here.
In the 80s.
The Africa.
Yes, on the Africa. So it's very interesting how these vessels are used in different ways through history.
Yes. Of course, most of our conversation today will be based on your book, which is sort of that story of your journey. But we keep coming in and out of it. You were born in South Africa, and your book, of course, has got 3 parts. Why was it important to document this?
For me, and I talk about it in the book, my catalyst was Rhodes Must Fall.
Okay.
I talk about it in detail in terms of the very moment of when that was happening at UCT. And I walk into a classroom, a master's classroom, and we start engaging with the conversation. Okay. What was very pertinent for me was that it was obvious and clear that people were coming with a story to the classroom space. And they wanted their stories to be heard. And their stories were relevant not only to what was happening at UCT. It was relevant in terms of how they were learning and creating films. And filmmaking is an emotional concept. It's an emotional construct. You get involved with your films, you draw on emotions. And this becomes a very important part of the creative process when we're making films. But what Rhodes Must Fall was it concretized the fact that location, landscape, architecture, space and place has memory. And being filmmakers, we could use the camera to make the invisible visible.
Okay.
And you know, there were lots of, as the movement gained momentum, there were lots of events and incidences that happened at different universities. And I told my students, I said, go take a camera and go and make the invisible visible. Go find the invisible memories that are entrenched in our own city. And let's talk about it. So that was the catalyst that you really could, that geography, that the structures that we work in house memories that affect the way we interact in spaces. And that's how I started this idea of uncovering memory and going on this journey on different facets of memory.
I mean, it's interesting that something like that, a big protest like that, ignites a lot of things. I mean, I've spoken to students, one who said, wow, it helped me claim my voice. Since then, I got onto the dean's list. I became free to think.
Yes.
And for you, it gave you this space to talk to students about their memory, for them to make them visible, make the invisible visible. And then also it started a journey for you to uncovering your own memory.
Yes.
And just as an aside, I mean, as much as protests are very disruptive and traumatic for both the protesters and the people to whom the protest is targeted, it seems to me that they are important because they give birth to something, and we don't always foreground what they have given birth to.
Absolutely.
Should we always wait for them?
No, I don't think we should. You know, the end of my book is there's no conclusion. It's called Moving Forward, because the idea is let us jump off and move forward. Let us engage. So I engage and I encourage my readers to go on their own journeys. And I go into quite a bit of the chapter 9 is so the different workshops that I host that I go throughout the book. And in chapter 9, I was invited to 2 residencies at Film University Babelsberg in Berlin. So initially I speak to students and I talk about work that we were doing with students in South Africa, and then I go off to Germany. Now, memory studies is rooted in the Shoah and the Holocaust, and it becomes quite pertinent in terms of, it was looking at how German students were looking at their own past. So, and for me, South Africa and Germany and the Iron Curtain are very interrelated. And I mean, we were separated in the 1940s. We were reunified with the coming down of the Berlin Wall in the November 1989. The Berlin Wall comes down. 1990, Nelson Mandela is released from prison in February. And I think all these political events are interlinked. So it was interesting for me to see how German students were dealing with their traumatic past and comparing that to how South African students were dealing with their traumatic past. But then as I moved through the journey, I had to become more center of the research, and I had to become the guinea pig. I had to go on my own journey. But chapter 9, I work with students who, it was a 5-day summer school course with participants that were not filmmakers. So they learned to make films on their cell phones in 4 days, literally. Day 5, we screened. And I go in detail through the course. So it's like a short course to encourage people who aren't filmmakers to engage and create their own content. I was very clear also, I've used YouTube as the platform to link the films because I was breaking silos. And for me, I'm breaking silos in the academic writing, in the structure of the book, because there's no like classical introduction and conclusion. And I'm breaking structures in terms of I didn't choose to use a Vimeo platform. It's YouTube. It's accessible to everybody. It's something that people who aren't, it breaks the exclusivity of filmmaking and making it accessible. So the book, how it's breaking the structures and is about how do we break the silos. So how do we break the silos in our writing? How do we break the silos in our filmmaking? How do we make them accessible? And that is what I'm doing in the book.
What you're doing in the book is symbolically, it's very important. I mean, in terms of all the disciplines, if you think about it. But of course, breaking the silos in the writing and the structure and so on is not so easy. I mean, of course, it depends who goes to the front. And it's important that Professor Sakota goes to the front because she's already professor. Students always wonder, if I break the silos as a student, could I be penalized for it? I mean, in the way that I write an essay or whatever, or in the way that I interact and so on. And that's it's important, but it can be risky for junior people or students.
Okay. Look, I wasn't a professor when I started writing the book, so that I don't think my title or position within the university affected anything in terms of the book. And
I wasn't thinking the university. I'm thinking the credibility in the academy.
Yeah. So, but I think, Marcella will know this, that I always tell my students break the rigidity of structure and blur the boundaries. I always tell them blur the boundaries. So for me, when I see a student challenging the boundaries and kind of blurring them and crossing them, I get very excited.
And that's great. Me too. But let's face it, Tanya, it's not because that's part of the decolonization agenda. Decolonizing how we teach, decolonizing what happens at universities. It's exactly what you are challenging the students to do. But that kind of disruption is not always accepted in all the engagements in universities or courses or by all academics. Like, there's a way of writing. This is how you're going to write. This is how you
Look, I think, and it goes back to your issue about protest.
Yes.
I think it's the silent protest.
Okay.
It's not the physical protest. It's when enough people get on board and do it. They start to kind of remold and reshape.
Yeah.
And I think definitely, I mean, there are certain disciplines that will defy what I'm doing in the book.
Yeah.
They will. But I think it's part of the challenge. And the more we engage with it, the more change can happen. And I think even it's also about finding your home and finding your people. But it's about once you find that space and location, that it grows. And the book, Wits Press, initially, when I spoke to them about the book, they said, you know, we publish academic work, you know. And I said, yeah, I know you publish, but I'm trying to, you know, make it about selling books, not about making students want to read.
Yeah.
And since that first conversation I had with them to now, which was in 2018, so it's like 5 years later, they're looking very differently at academic publishing. And if you look at the work that has come out in the last couple of years from Wits Press, and I'm talking about Wits Press because I know them.
That's what you know. Yeah.
And
but many academic presses would do the same.
Yeah.
Is this academic enough?
But they're really challenging. Yeah. You know, if you look at the book that came out, I think last year or the year before, Archives of Times Past, it's looking at the undocumented archive of our history in South Africa. And it's about using official and unofficial documents. And when does a newspaper, you know, when is a news report relevant in terms of documenting and archiving the past, in terms of an experience of a person? So if you look at a book like that, it's also challenging the boundaries. You know, there are a number of projects that have come out, I think specifically in the last 4 years, that are really where you've got a very traditional publishing company that has existed. I mean, Wits Press now has just celebrated 100 years, is really breaking the silos and the boundaries of what they're doing. And I think the more that this is embraced and the more that writers take on this position, the more scope and the more it'll open doors.
True. And I like the fact that there are people who shake the boundaries, disrupt the spaces in that way, because I think it's not just about academic publishing. It's also about ways of being, seeing and doing that have to be disrupted. And my point is that it's not always easy. I mean, the sentence that says, but that's not how things are done. It's the thing that says, go back to tradition. I mean, I know it very well. That's not what VCs should do.
Yes, yeah.
You know, VC should do this. Or that's not academic enough. Yeah. It's the same kind of thing.
Yes.
And in a way, this book came out as a result of a disruptive moment. It's powerful and it's disrupting something. So moments of disruption give birth to other things that continue the disruption. But they also make us aware of what we don't know. And I think your story, I mean, I want you to go back to telling, because you went back to Germany to walk the path sort of your dad, you know, and experience and then write about it. I mean, it's not like you were born there, but in a way, the trauma of your parents, you sort of owned it.
Yeah.
You know, you it's almost, when you speak, it's almost like you were there, but you were not there. You were born in South Africa.
Yeah.
But it's part of you.
So this was very interesting for me. And now you talk about, for example, I play with the idea of epigenetics creatively. Now, there are some psychologists that refuse to acknowledge that epigenetics is valid. And that is that we inherit some kind of memories in our DNA. Yeah. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not going into it. But I'm saying, from my own experience, when I went into the building where my mother was born, and she told me about the experiences of remembering as a toddler, very traumatic events, which I describe in the book. If I can, but now it wasn't expected. I went into the space and I remembered the memories that were told to me years ago. So it wasn't like I was going to find the memory. I went to this space, and that's the beauty about practice-based research for me, is I took the camera and I said, what is it going to uncover? And as I was filming, those memories came in my head. By default, they came into me. And so what I'm doing is I'm playing with the concept. If I could have these memories, if these things could trigger, but I could feel them, then let me play creatively with this concept without refuting or accepting that scientifically this exists or doesn't exist. Yeah. So let me, as an artist, as a filmmaker, play with the concept. So that's what I do, in the sense that I start playing with those memories. So when I go back, what's interesting, so when my first journey was in 1997, I went to my father's village in it's called Kozice. It's in Herzegovina, which is now part of Bosnia-Herzegovina. I go to get access. I need a UN escort, because this is after Dayton Peace Accord was signed at the end of 1995, but it's still very volatile. And the area I'm going into is mined. And when I went to find a UN escort, they told me, you need to find your own car, you need to go in front of us, because if you hit a mine, you hit it first. Wow. And I'd actually been twice. So I went in 1996, and my family... I mean,
in South Africa, we don't know landmines, but Mozambique had a lot of them.
We do, yes. Yeah. And
Mozambique and Angola had a lot.
So my father's family were refugees at that time, having to move during that war that broke up the former Yugoslavia, and we had no car, we had nothing. So I go back in 97 because my cousin now has a car that we can go. And ironically, I go back to the UN and I tell them I want to go here, and the red zones and everything. And they look at me and they go, now it's about 8 or 10 months have passed. Yeah. And they say to me, you've been here before. So it shows you, like, I don't think anyone wanted to go there in those 8 or 10 months. And we say, fine, we've got the car, we're going, follow us, just get us in. Which is madness if you think of it. Yes. And then we have to go to this town called Stolac, and we get access. And I go to the village, and ironically, I think my journey to uncovering memory without being conscious of it started in 1997. Because I was going into this, and there are images in the book of the place, and there are images of the place in the film as well, that is linked in the book. I remember my childhood memories. I'd only been there a few times, but I remember specific stories of events that I'd experienced. But when I went in 2018 to Poland, to where my mother was born, I was remembering memories that were not mine, that were narrated to me. Yeah. So it became, what I love about memory, it's unreliable. You know, memory is the most unreliable thing of remembering something, because we forget more than what we remember. Yes. But I like to use those cracks as the strength. And it moves. So it's what you remember at a specific moment in time and how you remember it. Yeah. And I think that's what I do in the film. I talk about the film also has 3 parts, part 1, part 2, part 3. And it looks at 3 specific moments. But what it is trying to embrace is a very personal story. I'm the narrator, I'm the voiceover. It uses different modes of representation in terms of documentary. But what it's trying to show is that the pain that comes with war is universal. And the separation, the violence of separation and segregation is universal. And that is a common thread in terms of the theme of the book. And I start in South Africa, I move to Germany, I come back, I go to Cornhill. And in each scenario, I'm trying to uncover different forms of memory, whether it's politics, whether it's cultural, whether it's historical, towards the end, it's more personal. But in all those interactions with different forms of memory, it's about the violence of being associated with that memory. And then So the idea initially when the book started was I was looking at this idea of traumatic memory and tormenting memory from the outside in. I was talking to students about the violence of apartheid, the violence of colonization without having experienced it.
Yeah.
So we were on the outside looking at something in. And that was the idea, that I was looking at this idea of traumatic memory from the outside and in. But a third of the way in the book, I am thrown into a traumatic event, a personal traumatic event. And all of a sudden, I'm in the center of trauma. And I'm no longer, I cannot look from the outside in, because all of a sudden I am it. And I can only look from the outside, from the inside out. So the book changes somewhat in the writing because my position shifts. And I won't talk about what exactly happened because I'll leave it for the readers to experience that. It does come out in the book in a very specific way. And so for the sake of the readers, I won't talk about that event, but that was the defining moment for me in terms of how I understood and how I experienced. And it comes through quite strongly in terms of as my personal journey develops. And what happened for me, the traumatic event happened in 2020 in March. So it's just before the lockdown. And I'm exploding with pain and emotion. It takes me a long time to get back to the book. I get back to the book in 2020. 2020, I do nothing. And then slowly I start channeling all that emotion. And I channel it, but it was very weird because it came through in the words. And without exploding outwards, it explodes in the form of the words in the book.
Wow. That's interesting. I mean, in a way, it's interesting how you wrote the three sections and ended up with looking from within. And you also talk about war all throughout. And in the world and in history, people refer to the different kinds of violences in different ways. So sometimes people say genocide, holocaust. But it's interesting that, what happened in South Africa is not regarded as genocide. But I think if we were doing by numbers, we should be calling it a genocide. And the number of people who just died.
And disappeared.
They
haven't been found. Absolutely.
So it's not like in Rwanda that they were burnt in one church or in whatever. It's not like, in Germany that the Jews were hauled into the gas chambers, but it's a similar kind of thing. And it's fascinating to see how these things are named and how people respond to the violent situations in their context. You have worked with students in Germany and the students here. What are the differences in the way young people sort of reflect on their trauma? And as I'm asking you, I keep thinking it probably would also be influenced by their current context and conditions. But what do you see as differences in how they make the invisible visible, how they talk about it?
Okay, so what was very interesting for me was relevance. But before I talk about relevance, let me just talk about the concept of genocide in South Africa, because I was speaking to Marcelo earlier and I was in my head wanted to go there in terms of the TRC. And absolutely, it's about also the labels we give things, because we haven't as this nation engaged with the numbers of apartheid. We haven't engaged with how many people were not found. And creatively, if you look at like films like Zulu Love Letter and a lot of films that were coming out in the mid-1990s, were talking about that. But as a nation, it's also about, it's very much about the label. What do you give the label and what is the number associated, and when do you not give a number? And I think that's a conversation that needs to take place. But in terms of this idea of how the generation, whether they were South African or Germany, were looking at the past, for me, what was interesting was the word relevance. It was understanding who they were in relation to the moment in the past that they were uncovering. So in the book, I actually give space. Each of the filmmakers have a platform to communicate what they'd like to speak about in terms of their own reflection. And you get their voice. So I meander, I'm the narrator sometimes, I'm the facilitator, I'm the filmmaker, I'm the... and then I become the subject of the research. So I'm the tour guide. One of the peer reviewers said I move through these different roles. But for me, what was important was how they found the memories relevant, because it was always relevant. What they were uncovering and the spaces they choose to interact with were relevant to their lives today. Each space had an impact in terms of who they were today. And for me, that's how we need to look at how we negotiate a space in a classroom. You come in a classroom space and everyone has a different background. Everyone has a different experience of the past. But we need to understand that before we can actually start working together. You know, you mentioned at the beginning, I'm the first white person that you've interviewed. We need to negotiate who you are in this space, who I am in this space, how you see me, how I see you. And once we understand that, then we can start working. But you can't start working if you don't acknowledge that, because otherwise it just exists as this elephant in the room that's just ignored. But it is so important to work through that. And especially in something like film studies, we need to acknowledge that before we can engage. And especially with my fourth years, I always ask them to do like a beginning exercise. I do it with the undergrads as well, in terms of start with an exercise. And usually that exercise negotiates the space. So through the viewings of those exercises, we understand each other. And once we can understand each other, then we can work together because we understand who we're working with. And that, for me, is so important.
Yeah. And I think we need a lot of that in South Africa, actually, in many contexts. Tanja, thank you so much for talking to me. I don't have the book, but I'm going to get a copy.
Okay.
It's published by Wits Press. Where can people get it?
Okay, so it's available on Loot, available on Takealot, or you can order it through Exclusive Books.
Okay, fantastic. Takealot, Exclusive Books. I'm gonna get it because it's interesting. By the way, the book is written in very accessible language. It's not your academic jargon and so on. But let me just end by thanking Tanja, but also thanking the Rhodes Must Fall activists. You know, the protest is uncomfortable, but it also ignites ideas and so on. It's done a lot for us in terms of what has come out of what we want to explore, what we want to do after that. And so thank you for, and I'm talking as a former university executive, for making us uncomfortable, for looking at things that we were not looking at, for making the invisible visible. And I'm sure that practice, my hope is that practice continues. So thank you so much for joining me. Remember to live your life authentically. It is only when you live your life authentically that you can make a difference. So continue being and doing you. Thank you very much. See you tomorrow.